Part 1. What life was really like in America in the 1880s. Hey guys, tonight we're going to take a long, quiet wander through America in the 1880s. So go ahead, dim the lights, get cozy, maybe sip something warm, because we're not rushing anywhere. This isn't going to be one of those flashy, action-packed history lectures with Civil War cannon fire where the Founding Fathers dramatically signing things. No. We're going to drift slowly through the decade where America thought it was growing up, but honestly, it was still very much in its awkward teenage phase. Now, when people hear the 1880s, they usually think of a couple of things. Cowboys, railroads, maybe those stiff portraits of serious-looking men with massive mustaches, and women whose necks seemed permanently stuck in lace collars. And yes, that's definitely part of it. But the reality of living in the 1880s was a whole messy soup of contradictions. It was glamorous for some, exhausting for most, and just plain bizarre if you zoom in closely enough. So, let's float into that world. The streets smelled like horse manure, the air buzzed with industrial smoke, and somewhere, someone was probably selling a miracle elixir that was mostly alcohol and morphine. Welcome to America in the 1880s. First off, transportation. If you wanted to get anywhere in the 1880s, you basically had three options. One, your own two legs, which fine, but cities were filthy and shoes weren't cheap. Two, a horse, if you could afford to feed it. Or three, the shiny new symbol of the age, the railroad. By the 1880s, railroads were exploding across the country like over-caffeinated vines. Entire towns existed just because a railroad company decided to plop down a stop. If your town got skipped, tough luck. Enjoy fading into obscurity. Trains connected New York to San Francisco in less than a week, which was insane at the time. Imagine being used to a months-long, miserable wagon ride where half your kids probably got dysentery, and suddenly you can glide across the continent in a few days, eating dining car meals that pretended to be fancy. Of course, it wasn't all glamour. The railroads were also monopolistic nightmares. The tycoons running them, men like Jay Gould, basically behaved like Bond villains with better hats. Prices were inconsistent, corruption was rampant, and farmers were constantly at their mercy. But still, people rode the trains because, well, walking to California wasn't really an option. And speaking of farmers, let's talk about rural life. Most Americans in the 1880s still lived in small towns or on farms. Forget the skyscrapers and jazz-age glamour you might picture later. This was mostly people waking up at dawn, doing back-breaking work, and going to bed exhausted. Farm technology was improving, sure. Steel plows, reapers, and other machinery made big farms more efficient. But for the average small farmer, it just meant they had to compete with massive commercial farms, and often failed. Also, farming was lonely. You might see your neighbors once in a while at church or when you both ended up at the same general store. Otherwise, it was endless corn, wheat, or cows. Romantic, right? Except for the droughts and the grasshopper plagues and the occasional tornado ripping through your barn. Oh, and let's not forget, the 1880s were smack in the middle of a long economic cycle of boom and bust. Prices for crops would tank, leaving farmers miserable, which is partly why so many of them started organizing politically, hinting at the populist movement that would gain steam in the 1990s. But we'll get to that later. Meanwhile, cities were doing the opposite of lonely. City life in the 1880s was crowded, dirty, noisy, and if you were wealthy, actually kind of fun. Let's take New York City. By this time, it had over 1 million people crammed into it. Immigrants poured in daily, especially from Ireland, Germany, and starting more and more from Italy and Eastern Europe. They often ended up in tenements. These were basically overcrowded apartment blocks with little light, less air, and way too many rats. Whole families would be stuffed into one room, with a bathroom shared by everyone on the floor. So, not exactly luxury living. But if you were rich, city life was dazzling. This was the Gilded Age, after all. Millionaires were flaunting their wealth with absurd mansions, parties, and private clubs. Think Vanderbilt balls where women wore actual jewels sewn into their gowns. Because why not literally turn yourself into a walking safety hazard? This was the era where someone like Mrs. Astor decided who was in New York society and who was not. If she didn't invite you to her famous 400 parties, well, you may as well not exist socially. The contrast was ridiculous. One part of town, kids were dying of cholera from contaminated water. Another part, guests were eating caviar off silver spoons under chandeliers the size of small planets. Let's drift over to fashion, because you know we can't just ignore that. In the 1880s, women's clothing was intense. Layers upon layers of fabric, corsets cinching waists to alarming sizes, and most importantly, the bustle. Yes, the bustle. That strange little wire or padding contraption worn under skirts to give the appearance of a dramatically puffed-out backside. Why? Because apparently Victorian society decided that the ideal female shape should resemble a human question mark. Women teetered around with these exaggerated silhouettes looking like walking furniture. And of course, the dresses were heavy, hard to clean, and absolutely impractical for, say, actually walking briskly. Men, meanwhile, had it easier. Suits were the uniform. Dark, sober, respectable. Hats were non-negotiable. A man without a hat in the 1880s might as well have been naked. Facial hair was everywhere, too. Massive mustaches, pointed beards, the whole catalog of whiskery styles. Basically, the male fashion motto was, look serious and look hairy. Now let's glide into the home itself. What did an American house look like in the 1880s? Well, for the middle class, it was often a Victorian-style house full of dark wood, heavy drapes, and knickknacks on every surface. Minimalism was not the vibe. The more cluttered, the more tasteful. Parlors were filled with bric-a-brac, family portraits, and maybe a piano if you wanted to impress guests. Lighting came from gas lamps in many cities, though electricity was starting to sneak in. Thomas Edison had lit up parts of New York in 1882, but for most people, electricity was still a novelty. Imagine seeing a light bulb for the first time. It must have felt like witchcraft. Bathrooms? If you were lucky, maybe you had indoor plumbing, but plenty of families still relied on outhouses and chamber pots. Baths were infrequent, often once a week, and usually shared water, which meant if you were the youngest kid, by the time it was your turn, well, let's just say it wasn't exactly a spa experience. Now, let's talk about health, because medicine in the 1880s was, well, let's just say you didn't want to get seriously ill. Germ theory was gaining acceptance, yes, but doctors were a mixed bag. Surgery often happened without proper sterilization. Anesthesia existed, but antiseptics weren't always used, which meant you might survive an operation only to die of infection afterward. Hospitals were places you went if you were desperate. Wealthier people often preferred to be treated at home, which honestly might have been safer. As for medicine, the drug industry was basically the Wild West. You could buy over-the-counter tonics that promised to cure everything from headaches to female troubles. Spoiler, they usually contained a lot of alcohol, opium, or cocaine. Coca-Cola was literally invented in 1886 as a nerve tonic. Yes, original Coke really did have cocaine in it. People loved it. Public health was uneven too. Cities were plagued with outbreaks of cholera, diphtheria, and tuberculosis. Infant mortality rates were high. So, yeah, life expectancy wasn't great, but at least you could drown your sorrows in your medicinal cocaine wine. All right, let's drift over to entertainment. What did people actually do for fun in the 1880s? Well, if you were urban middle class, you might go to the theater. Vaudeville shows were on the rise, variety acts with singers, comedians, acrobats, you name it. If you wanted something classier, there was opera or symphonies. Sports were starting to gain traction too. Baseball was becoming the national pastime. Teams like the Chicago White Stockings drew crowds, even if players weren't exactly the millionaire celebrities of today. Boxing was popular, though not exactly legal everywhere. And bicycle clubs were a big thing. Yes, the penny farthing, the giant front-wheeled bicycle, was a symbol of the age. Riding one without falling off was basically an extreme sport. For the wealthy, entertainment often meant private parties, hunting trips, or European travel. Because nothing says, "I'm rich," like complaining about Parisian hotels while the rest of the country eats beans for dinner. And we can't forget politics, because the 1880s were a political circus. This was the era of presidents nobody remembers. Seriously, can you list them off? Rutherford B. Hayes, sort of, 1877, then James Garfield, who got assassinated, then Chester A. Arthur, then Grover Cleveland, then Benjamin Harrison, then Cleveland again. It was like presidential musical chairs. None of these guys were particularly inspiring. The Gilded Age was all about political corruption, backroom deals, and patronage systems. Who you knew mattered more than what you stood for. Garfield's assassination in 1881 was especially depressing. He wasn't even in office long enough to accomplish much, but he still got shot by a disgruntled office seeker who thought he deserved a government job. The doctors probably killed Garfield more than the bullet did, since they poked around in his wound with unwashed hands. Classic 1880s medicine. And finally, let's not forget race relations, because the 1880s were not some golden era of equality. The Civil War had ended less than 2 decades before, but Reconstruction was already dismantled. By the mid-1880s, Jim Crow laws were tightening their grip in the South. African Americans faced systematic disenfranchisement, segregation, and violence. The promise of freedom was being crushed by a wave of white supremacy. Meanwhile, Native Americans were being forced onto reservations. The government's policy was essentially assimilate or vanish. The 1880s saw the infamous Dawes Act of 1887, which broke up communal tribal lands to push individual ownership, a strategy designed to destroy native culture. It was marketed as progress, but really, it was land theft, dressed in legal language. And Chinese immigrants? They faced the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, which pretty much did what it says on the label. Banned Chinese laborers from immigrating. Because nothing says land of opportunity like slamming the door shut on entire groups of people. So, yeah, the 1880s in America were a strange mix. Railroads, robber barons, extravagant parties, suffocating poverty, quack medicine, political mediocrity, and deeply entrenched racism. It was both a decade of dazzling modern progress and grim social realities. But hey, that's just the beginning. We're only scratching the surface here. So stay comfy, because next we'll drift even deeper into what people actually ate, how kids grew up, what dating and marriage looked like, and all the little daily routines that made up life in this bizarre decade. Part 2. Eating, family life, and the fine art of surviving the 1880s. All right, you're still with me. Good. Let's lean back a little deeper into our pillow fort of history and wander into some of the quieter, more everyday corners of life in the 1880s America. Because while railroad tycoons were scheming and presidents were getting assassinated, regular people were mostly just trying to eat, raise kids, and avoid typhoid. So, what exactly was on the table? Food and diet in the 1880s. First of all, the idea of 3 square meals a day was solidly in place by the 1880s. Breakfast, dinner, and supper. But don't picture pancakes stacked sky-high with syrup and a side of bacon. Breakfast was often less thrilling. In rural America, you might get cornmeal mush, bread with butter, or maybe salt pork and eggs if you were lucky. Coffee was basically mandatory, even if it tasted like boiled mud. In fact, people drank coffee all day, partly because water wasn't always safe. Urban families had a bit more variety. By the 1880s, canned goods were sneaking into kitchens. Canned tomatoes, condensed milk, even fancy things like canned oysters if you felt adventurous. Ice boxes, basically wooden refrigerators cooled by big blocks of ice, were common in middle-class homes, so food could last a little longer than eat it today or watch it rot. And dinner, the big meal, often at midday, was hearty. Think stews, roasts, potatoes in every imaginable form, and bread with everything. Vegetables were there, but usually boiled until they surrendered. Fresh fruit was seasonal, unless you counted jam or preserves, which appeared on nearly every pantry shelf. And yes, alcohol flowed freely. Beer was cheap and widely consumed, and whiskey was basically an honorary food group. Remember, this is still a few decades before Prohibition. If you were stressed, tired, or just alive in the 1880s, chances are you had a drink, or 2, or 5. And for dessert, pies. Always pies. Apple, mince, custard. Pie was practically a national pastime. Ice cream parlors were also popping up in cities, offering a sweet escape from smoky streets. Oh, and one more thing. Oysters. Americans in the 1880s were obsessed with them. They were cheap, plentiful, and eaten by everyone from rich socialites to dock workers. Imagine oyster carts on street corners the way we think of hot dog stands today. It was a whole mollusk economy. So, after dinner, what was family life actually like? Well, in short, busy, noisy, and full of kids. Families were big. 6, 7, even 10 children weren't unusual, partly because child mortality was so high. The sad truth was that not every child survived to adulthood. Parents expected to lose some along the way, which sounds horrifying to us, but was just a grim fact of life then. Fathers were usually the breadwinners, farmers, laborers, shopkeepers, while mothers were expected to run the household. And run really meant cook 3 meals a day from scratch, sew clothes, keep the house clean, without vacuum cleaners, mind you, do laundry by hand, and raise a small army of children. Basically, being a 19th century mother was a full-time, unpaid survival job. Still, families did have fun together. Board games like checkers and dominoes, reading aloud from books or newspapers, and if you had musical talent, gathering around the piano to sing. Entertainment was mostly homemade. No Netflix, just your dad reading The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn out loud and hoping he did the voices.
Schools and education. Let's move on to school. What did education look like in the 1880s? Well, the classic Little Red Schoolhouse was still very real in rural areas. One teacher, all grades, crammed into a single room. Imagine trying to teach 6-year-olds their ABCs while also lecturing 16-year-olds about algebra, all at the same time. Teachers were often young women, barely out of high school themselves, working for shockingly low wages. School days were long, and discipline was strict. Talking out of turn? Wooden ruler to the knuckles. Not paying attention? You might get sent to stand in the corner with a dunce cap, which, yes, was an actual cone-shaped hat designed to humiliate children into paying attention. Nothing says great pedagogy like psychological warfare at age 7. Subjects included reading, writing, arithmetic, geography, and a heavy dose of moral instruction. Textbooks like McGuffey's readers were standard. filled with lessons on hard work, obedience, and honesty. Science and history got some attention, but the main goal was to produce literate, disciplined citizens. Higher education? That was mostly for the wealthy. Colleges existed, of course, Harvard, Yale, Princeton, but they were elite institutions for elite families. By the 1880s, more state universities were opening, and some women's colleges too. But the idea of everyone goes to college was still a long way off. Courtship and marriage. Now, let's float over to love and romance, because yes, people were still falling in love in the 1880s, just with a lot more rules. Courtship was highly structured. You didn't just stroll up to someone in a bar and say hi. Respectable young men and women met through family connections, church, or supervised social events. A young lady would often be introduced to eligible bachelors at a formal gathering, and from there, carefully chaperoned visits could begin. And by visits, I mean literally sitting in the parlor with the girl's family hovering nearby. Privacy was minimal. Courtship rituals involved things like exchanging calling cards, leaving flowers, or attending dances. A calling card, by the way, was basically the 19th century version of texting hey. You'd leave your little card at someone's house, and they'd know you'd stopped by. Marriage often happened young. Women might marry in their late teens or early 20s. Men a little older once they had a job or farm. Divorce existed, but was rare and scandalous. Unless your spouse was truly awful, society expected you to just deal with it. And yes, gender roles were strictly enforced. Men provided, women maintained the home. If you were a woman with ambitions beyond housework, you faced steep barriers. Still, some women were beginning to push boundaries, working as teachers, nurses, or writers. The women's suffrage movement was simmering in the background, not yet at full boil, but very much alive. Social customs and manners. Now, if you're imagining yourself time traveling to the 1880s, you should probably brush up on etiquette, because Victorians loved rules. Everything had a rule. How to sit, how to stand, how to eat soup, hint, tip the spoon away from you. Even how to cough in public. There were whole books written about proper behavior, like Emily Post's For the Overdressed. For the middle and upper classes, etiquette was a way of signaling status. The wrong fork at dinner could mark you as hopelessly provincial. Visiting cards, proper mourning clothes after a relative's death, not speaking too loudly in mixed company, these were all little signals of refinement. Working class people didn't obsess quite as much, but manners still mattered. Respectability was currency. Even if you lived in a crowded tenement, you might save up for a decent Sunday dress or suit, so you could show the world you weren't just some unwashed street urchin. Church attendance was also a major social custom. Even if you weren't deeply religious, church was where you saw your neighbors, exchanged news, and quietly judged who was wearing last year's hat. Leisure for the ordinary folks. So, how did ordinary people relax in between all that work and the etiquette? Reading was huge. Newspapers were cheap and everywhere, filled with everything from politics to serialized fiction. People also loved dime novels, cheap sensational stories about cowboys, detectives, or pirates. Basically pulp fiction before pulp fiction. Fairs and festivals were common in rural areas. Harvest festivals, 4th of July picnics, county fairs with pie contests, and maybe a Ferris wheel if you were lucky. These were the highlights of the social calendar. And let's not forget about music. Parlor songs were popular, with families gathering around a piano to sing sentimental tunes. If you didn't own a piano, someone in town probably did, and you could drop by for a sing-along. In cities, you could catch brass bands, vaudeville shows, or just street performers on busy corners. In other words, people made their own fun. Which is charming, until you remember that the alternative was sitting silently in the dark because gas lamps weren't cheap. So there we have it. Life in the 1880s wasn't all robber barons and railroads. It was mush for breakfast, giant families squeezed into clapboard houses, kids memorizing moral lessons in one-room schools, and awkward courtships under the watchful eye of someone's aunt. It was a world where etiquette books told you how to sneeze properly, where your main source of fun might be a pie contest, and where oysters somehow counted as a national obsession. Not glamorous, not tragic, just quietly, weirdly human. And next, we'll drift even deeper into that human side, into work, wages, gender roles, and what it actually felt like to live on the edge of America's so-called Gilded Age. Part 3. Work, wages, and the joy of exploitation in the 1880s. All right, let's stretch out a little bit because it's time to go to work. Not you, you're lying in bed, hopefully sinking further into that cozy pre-sleep haze. But let's imagine ourselves as an average American in the 1880s, because chances are we'd be spending most of our waking hours, well, working. And working a lot.
The shape of work. The United States in the 1880s was in the middle of its great industrial transformation. Farms still dominated, sure, but factories were multiplying, railroads were swallowing landscapes, and cities were pulsing with smokestacks. If you were in a city, you might be working in a textile mill, a steel plant, a coal mine, or a factory turning out everything from shoes to cigars to sewing machines. Machinery was noisy, dangerous, and relentless. Forget OSHA regulations. Those didn't exist. If you lost a finger in a machine, management's response was usually, well, don't do that again. Hours were brutal. A standard shift could run 10 to 12 hours a day, 6 days a week. Sunday was your one shot at rest, assuming you weren't doing chores or attending church. Vacations? Almost unheard of. Sick days? Please. If you couldn't work, you probably got fired. And wages were not generous. A skilled worker might earn $10 to $15 a week. Unskilled laborers, even less. Women usually earned about half what men did for the same work. And children, yes, children, could earn maybe $1 or $2 a week. Child labor. Let's pause on that, because child labor was everywhere. Factories, mines, textile mills, glassworks, kids as young as 8 or 9 were often employed, sometimes even younger, depending on how desperate the family was. They crawled into coal chutes, too small for adults, ran errands, or worked dangerous machines. School was important, yes, but feeding your family came first. Many children juggled both, going to school part-time and working part-time. And of course, accidents were common. A child's small hands were great for untangling jammed machinery until, well, they weren't anymore. We tend to think of childhood as a time of play, but for many 1880s kids, it was just endless labor with a side of exhaustion. And if you're thinking, wow, that sounds depressing. Yes, it was, but it was also just normal back then. Gender roles at work. Now, let's drift into gender for a moment, because the 1880s workforce was heavily divided along gender lines. Men dominated heavy industries like steel, railroads, and construction. Women were often pushed into female-appropriate work, textiles, garment factories, teaching, nursing, or domestic service. Thousands of young immigrant women, especially Irish and German, worked as maids in middle-class households. Living in meant you basically belonged to your employer's home 24/7, cooking, cleaning, and taking orders. And here's a fun twist. Women were often preferred for factory work because bosses could pay them less and expect them to complain less. Efficiency. Still, more women were entering the workforce, and that started raising questions. Should married women work? Should women be allowed in certain professions? These debates were just beginning, simmering under the surface of daily grind. The rise of labor unions. So, with all these long hours, low wages, and dangerous conditions, you might be wondering, when did people start saying, hey, maybe we deserve better? The 1880s were actually a huge decade for labor organizing. Workers were forming unions, going on strikes, and demanding changes like the 8-hour day. One of the biggest organizations was the Knights of Labor. Founded earlier, they really hit their stride in the 1880s. They welcomed all kinds of workers, skilled and unskilled, men and women, even black workers at a time when segregation ruled. Their vision was pretty radical for the age: equality, better pay, safer conditions, less child labor. But organizing was dangerous. Bosses hated unions, police hated strikes, and violence was never far away. The Haymarket Affair. Which brings us to one of the defining events of 1880s labor history, the Haymarket Affair of 1886. It began as a peaceful rally in Chicago. Workers were striking for the 8-hour day. Pretty reasonable, right? But then, during one gathering in Haymarket Square, someone threw a bomb at the police. Chaos erupted. Gunfire broke out. By the end, several people were dead, including both police and civilians. The actual bomber was never identified, but that didn't stop the authorities from rounding up anarchists and labor leaders, putting them on trial, and sentencing several to death. The whole thing terrified the middle class, discredited the Knights of Labor, and gave the labor movement a rough reputation for years. So yeah, asking for an 8-hour day in the 1880s was basically treated like terrorism. Mining and industrial life. Let's zoom in on one particularly grim type of work: coal mining. Mines were dirty, dangerous, and absolutely essential. Coal fueled everything: railroads, factories, homes. Miners went down into dark shafts, often for 10 to 12 hours, breathing dust, with explosions and cave-ins as constant risks. Death rates were high. And yet entire communities depended on mines. Company towns sprung up, where everything, the houses, the store, even the church, was owned by the coal mining company. Workers were often paid in scrip, not real money, which could only be used at the company store, which, shockingly, always charged high prices. Imagine working all week, then realizing your wages barely bought enough to feed your family because your boss also controlled the grocery bill. Not exactly a recipe for prosperity. Railroads and strikes. Now, remember those glamorous railroads we talked about earlier? Well, railroad workers were some of the hardest hit in terms of exploitation. They built and maintained the tracks, operated trains, loaded cargo, all for modest pay and grueling schedules. Railroad companies were infamous for cutting wages whenever profits dipped. Workers had already erupted in the violent Great Railroad Strike of 1877, and tensions kept simmering in the 1880s. Strikes often spread like wildfire, halting entire lines. When this happened, railroad barons usually called in private security forces or asked state militias to put things down, which usually meant more violence. So every strike carried the risk of becoming deadly. But railroad workers persisted. After all, without them, America's shiny new national network didn't move. They were the backbone of the economy, but treated like disposable parts. Immigrant labor. Let's drift into immigration, because the workforce in the 1880s was increasingly immigrant-based. Irish, German, Italian, Chinese, Eastern European, all were pouring in. And employers loved it because immigrants were usually desperate for work and willing to accept low wages. Of course, this fueled resentment. Native-born workers accused immigrants of taking jobs or driving down pay. Anti-Chinese sentiment was particularly fierce, leading to the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. For the first time in U.S. history, the government outright banned a specific ethnic group from immigrating. And yet, immigrant labor built much of the country, laying railroad tracks, digging mines, working factories. They did the hardest, dirtiest jobs, often while facing discrimination both inside and outside the workplace. And yet, despite all this exploitation, there was this powerful cultural myth that hard work could lift you out of poverty. The 1880s were the golden years of rags to riches stories, popularized by writers like Horatio Alger. His dime novels told tales of poor boys who rose to success through honesty, grit, and luck. They were wildly popular because who doesn't want to believe that the system is fair? Of course, reality was harsher. Social mobility was limited. If you were born poor, chances are you stayed poor. But the dream was there, shimmering in the background, keeping people working, hoping, and striving. Domestic work and servants. One last corner of labor worth mentioning, domestic service. Middle and upper-class families almost always had live-in servants, usually young immigrant women. They cooked, cleaned, cared for children, did laundry, and generally held households together. For them, the work was long, the pay small, and the privacy non-existent. Still, it was steady employment, and for many immigrant women, it was a stepping stone. Work a few years as a maid, save some money, maybe move on to marriage or a slightly less grueling job. But the class divide was always sharp. Servants lived in the same house as their employers, yet inhabited an entirely different world. Upstairs, lavish dinner parties. Downstairs, exhaustion and dishwater. So, work in the 1880s wasn't glamorous. It was grueling, dangerous, and often unfair, but it was also the foundation of everything. America's cities, railroads,
fortunes. The Gilded Age glittered for the wealthy precisely because millions of ordinary people labored in the shadows. Next, we'll drift into technology, inventions, and how new gadgets began reshaping daily life in the 1880s. Because believe it or not, this was also the decade where electricity, telephones, and typewriters started sneaking into the picture. Part 4. The Long Afterlife of Piracy. The age of sail eventually passed. The great wooden ships gave way to steam, then steel. The Royal Navy, the Spanish Armada, the French fleets, all the great maritime powers turned their eyes toward empire, commerce, and industrial expansion. Piracy as it had once been, crews of desperate men hoisting black flags on creaking decks, was crushed, hunted, and outlawed. By the mid-18th century, the so-called Golden Age of piracy was largely over. But something curious happened. The pirates themselves refused to die, not in flesh, but in story. The world that had condemned them to the gallows and gibbet soon began resurrecting them on paper, in song, and eventually on screen. The pirate, once a nightmare for merchants, became a figure of romance, rebellion, and even heroism. The pirate in literature. The transformation began in literature. Daniel Defoe, the author of Robinson Crusoe, had already published accounts of pirate lives as early as the 1720s, blending fact and fiction. But it was in the 19th century that the pirate truly found immortality in print. Lord Byron and other romantic poets invoked seafaring outlaws as symbols of freedom against the tyranny of empire. Then came Robert Louis Stevenson's Treasure Island, 1883, perhaps the single most influential pirate tale ever written. With that book, the world inherited Long John Silver, cunning, charismatic, morally ambiguous, and unforgettable. Stevenson's novel gave us many of the tropes we now think of as classic pirate. The one-legged sailor with a parrot on his shoulder, buried treasure marked by an X, maps with winding trails and skulls in the corners, the cry of "pieces of 8." Suddenly, piracy was no longer merely about murder on the high seas. It was an adventure. Dangerous, yes, but also thrilling. Stage and screen. By the early 20th century, stage plays, operas, and later Hollywood films carried the myth further. Gilbert and Sullivan's Pirates of Penzance had already turned them into comic figures, bumbling but lovable. Silent films in the 1920s, with actors like Douglas Fairbanks swashbuckling across the screen, transformed pirates into athletic, daring heroes. Then came Earl Flynn in Captain Blood in 1935, sword flashing, charm radiating. Pirates were no longer just villains. They were men of destiny, wronged by corrupt systems, fighting with courage and panache. The pirate became a symbol of freedom against oppression, of individual daring against the machinery of empire. By the late 20th century, Disney's Pirates of the Caribbean ride and later the blockbuster film series cemented the myth for a global audience. Captain Jack Sparrow, with his swagger and wit, became perhaps the most recognizable pirate figure in modern culture. A trickster, survivor, and reluctant hero. Symbols of rebellion. Outside of fiction, the Jolly Roger, the skull and crossbones, was reborn. Once a flag of terror, it became a symbol of rebellion. It was painted on motorcycle jackets, flown at rock concerts, adopted by hackers and rebels alike. The pirate spirit became shorthand for anyone who resisted authority, who chose freedom over conformity. Even in politics and technology, piracy lived on. Pirate radio stations broadcast forbidden music. Digital pirates challenged copyright and corporate control. And political movements in Europe even launched pirate parties, demanding transparency and freedom of information. But why? Why did this figure of cruelty and lawlessness become beloved? Perhaps because deep down, pirates embodied something people secretly admired: the refusal to bow, the courage to seize life on their own terms. They were outsiders in a world of strict hierarchies. And while they committed terrible deeds, they also carved out a space of strange equality, where a poor sailor could vote, share spoils, and live by a code chosen by the crew, not imposed by a king. In this way, pirates became mirrors of our own desires: freedom, justice on our own terms, adventure beyond the horizon. And so, centuries after the last gallows claimed the last infamous buccaneer, the black flag still flies, not on the Caribbean seas, but in our imagination. In every story of rebellion, every anthem of freedom, every tale of treasure just beyond reach, the pirate lives on. The world may have hanged the body of piracy, but the myth refused the noose. And in that myth, romanticized, exaggerated, immortal, the pirates of old sail forever.